Hello, this is Professor Gruen, and welcome back to database class, web applications for databases, Manchester Community College. By now, hopefully you have read the appendix A, and you've installed the software that you've needed, Notepad, that you've installed MySQL Workbench, MySQL Server, and the things in the syllabus. And you will have read chapter 1 in the textbook. If you don't have this guy here, you're in trouble. So you definitely need to get moving on the textbook for sure. Chapter 1 is a lot of information, and if by now you feel like you been kind of overwhelmed with the amount of stuff that's been thrown at you in chapter 1, don't worry about it. It will come together for you the more you do it and you work with the objects and you work with MySQL and databases in general. For many of you who already have some database experience, maybe you've done some work in Access or you've done some work in Oracle or things like that, some of the concepts and stuff are very familiar to you. If you are really feeling totally clueless and you just don't get it, read the chapter again. Go through, make sure you've answered the homework assignments, and do that. So now, the way the book starts, it is very different, and it says so in the book itself. Typically, a lot of books that I've done have you create a database, create a table, and just build stuff and do it from scratch. Here, the book's pretty interesting is that they've laid out several databases for us, and that they have given us some data to look at and to start to understand. So by having a model and having something there, it actually helps us out. Kind of saying, how have people done this before, that we can get some ideas from them, and that works out actually pretty good, I think. Again, the goal of this class, we've got 8 weeks to go through 570 pages. So how many times have you bought a book? I know I have. And you've made it through chapter 1 or chapter 2, maybe up to chapter 3 or 4, but you never made it all the way to the end. Well, you're not going to be successful in this class unless you make it all the way to the end. What's really nice again about this book is each page, each couple of pages is a unique block of information. So you can read that and stop and absorb it and say, do I get it? Do I understand it? And so it's laid out very, very well. My goal, I've not gone through the book yet, so this is not a new topic to me, but it's a new book to me. And basically in these videos, the plan is I'm going to go to start at the first page of the chapter and read it, take a look at it, and let's do it, and let's see what we learn. And so basically I'm going to kind of guide you through it. So by now we should be at page 42. Page 41 actually is the table of contents of the chapter. Page 42 has us up and going on the MySQL Workbench, and what they're going to do is kind of introduce us to what MySQL Workbench is. Okay, the first thing we want to do is go into MySQL Workbench. And again, we're only working on Windows. If you have a Mac or a Linux, the steps might be slightly different, but we're focusing on Windows. Start. All programs. Find MySQL, and you'll see MySQL Workbench. There's a folder for MySQL Server command line. Back in the olden days, matter of fact, last semester, we were doing everything at the command line, because that's how the book had us do it. This semester, I'm real happy. We're just going to click on MySQL Workbench. MySQL Workbench will come up, and it might prompt you for a password. You remember when you installed MySQL Workbench, there was a password and that you had to enter. After you've done it the first time, it won't pop in. It won't ask you for that. And basically, there's 3 sections to MySQL Workbench. Think of a workbench as a place where there's a lot of stuff you can do on it. If you go out to my shop, I've got several benches, and I do kind of some stuff here and some stuff there. SQL development, we'll spend most of our time there, and that's where we're creating databases, connecting to databases, and working on it. Data modeling, that's where we do a lot of design work for data modeling. A lot of times there's been in the past we've actually used other tools to create entity relationship diagrams, but here it's built into the tool. And then server administration, this will be kind of an introduction to DBA or database administrator work. This is the stuff behind the scenes that a lot of times a developer doesn't do, but depending on the size of your organization and enterprise. So let's click into the first thing it wants us to do is, so that takes us to page 43, and I believe what we're going to start doing is clicking right here into the instance of MySQL. And what I'd like to do is, I want to draw you a little picture first. Think about this is your computer. On your computer, instance of MySQL. So we did an install of MySQL. And what we could do on our computer is actually have more than one instance of MySQL running. So it's very that you might have different versions of MySQL. You can have and the like. From there, on a given we would have a database. I want to make that word a little smaller. And what we can actually do on an instance of MySQL, on one instance, we can actually have many databases. Databases are groupings of information. I might have a database for a hockey project that I'm on, or I might have a database for a car project that I'm dealing with. I could have database, so it's really I might have a database for a e-commerce. Say if I had 3 businesses. I sold, I had a pet store, I might have a pet store database. If I had a sports store, I might have a sports store database. And if I had an auto shop, I might have an auto shop database. On a given database, in a given database, that what we would have as well would be, come on, tables. And we would have a lot of tables on a database. Potentially, we would have a lot of different tables. We could have things like customer table, parts table, and so this is a grouping of information. So we would have a lot of tables living within that database. And then in a table, then what happens there is that's where then we have columns or fields of data. Fields of data. And as we add a record, what we're talking about here is a record or a row. In each record and row, it ultimately will break down to a cell. And so that we could have this whole grouping of information. We could have all of this send to back, and if I format shape, oh, solid fill, I want to make that. Boom. All of this information multiple times can live within this instance of MySQL. So see how on your computer an instance of MySQL can have many databases, a database can have many tables, a table will have rows of data but they're separated into fields or columns, and they ultimately are broke down to a cell. So that's what we're going to be looking at. Okay, from this screen you can see that there's SQL development, data modeling, and server administration. And right here we can see that there is a local instance of MySQL 5.6, MySQL 5.6 on both of these sides here. If I go into the administrator side, now I just double click on that, I can see that this server is in fact up and running. And I can see how much memory is being used. I can look at the performance of the server. And for a lot of big databases and corporate databases, this information becomes really, really important. If for chance your server isn't up and running, if you click on Startup and Shutdown, you'll see a button here that says Stop Server. But at this point, our servers are in fact up and running, and so we're actually good to go. So I'm going to just exit out of the administrator, and then I'm going to double click on the SQL development. And if you remember correctly, what happened was in Appendix A, when we installed all the software, we actually installed some databases on our database server. The AP database, the EX, and the OM, and here's a test database as well. If I open up the AP database and take a look at, there's tables, views, and routines. A table is really where the data is stored. A view is a way of looking at more than one table at the same time. And routines, actually, that's code. And we'll be dealing with that in later chapters as well. If I click on tables, I can see several tables here that have been opened up. And so I'm going to stop a second. Okay, so the stuff we've talked about so far basically has been focusing on what is known as, this section here is the object browser. So within your instance of MySQL, what stuff is in it? And we have databases that are in it. In a database, as I showed you before on this PowerPoint, so basically what happens is on our computer we have an instance of MySQL, and then we can have a database here, and here is the EM database, and here is the AP database. And then within a given database, for instance, there's tables, and notice here there's the tables, the invoices. So within the AP database here, there is a table called invoices. Okay, so that gets us there, and that should put us right about page 51 now. So if you haven't read up to page 51, please stop the video and do that. Now, one of the first commands that you always learn is basically you want to look at your data. So we're going to select star, which basically says select all of the columns from the table called invoices. And I'll put a semicolon at the end of it, and I'm going to hit this little lightning bolt. Now if I had more than one statement on here, so watch, I'm going to hit the lightning bolt, it executes it, and now we're seeing the different columns, and we're seeing the rows of data that are here for that, and all the fields in it. Now if I was to also go select star from terms, and then if I click the lightning bolt, what it just did, watch it quickly, it did all the invoices and then it did the terms. So the difference between this lightning bolt and this lightning bolt is if I just put my cursor on a given row or statement and I hit the one with the little I, now it's just going to do that one only. There might be times that you want to execute more than one command at a time, that you would then, you could either select the commands you want and hit the I, or you say give me all the commands and hit the lightning bolt, or I just want the one command here. Okay, so now on page 52 and 53, it wants us to start getting into the details of a given table, and it's talking about the vendors table. So if I go select star from vendors, also, by the way, notice that my typing is, I'm typing the commands, the SQL command, MySQL commands in capitals, and then usually the information in lowercase. That's a habit that I've done for years. It's a standard for people who it's a way that people have differentiated the command from the actual data or the thing we're working on. It will still work. So if I go select star from vendors and I hit the I, I'm getting the vendors. But if I was to also go select star from vendors and then I hit the I there, that still works as well. But notice how the one with the capitals on the commands, especially when you're doing a lot of programming and programs are hundreds and thousands of lines long, this best practice is definitely a way to go. On page 53, the book tells you under description to do a right click on the table and select alter table. Before we do that, before we hit vendors and do a right click alter table, the command that you really, if you want to understand what is making up a table, you want to go describe, DESC, and then basically describe vendors. And then I'll click the I. And now what I'm seeing here is the makeup, the field names, the data type. Is it nullable? Is it a primary key? And is this their default information? And is this an auto-incrementing field? And here, this describe vendors is a lot safer than doing what the book says for just looking at data. And when you're looking, so I'm going to describe terms and click the little I. There's the terms table and what makes up that. Describe invoices, and then that's what makes up that. Whoops, I actually hit all of them that time and it all ran. So there's just the invoices. So now the book says, so we can run stuff at the command line, or the book, we can go right click, alter table. Now don't be afraid, we're not going to be altering it, making any changes right away, but we could. So at this point here, we could add another column of information. We can have that column of information, we can define the data type, and we can set all of the fields. If we decided that this vendor city really shouldn't be 50 characters long but needed to be 60 characters long, we could change that. If we wanted to add a new field, see here how it says vendors call COL. What's the name of this column and what are you going to do? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just, I could apply the changes I made, or here I'm just going to hit revert. I want to keep it the way it was. I didn't do anything. Let's see, delete. Matter of fact, it didn't even accept anything, I think. So now if I just flip over to the back, I'm just going to close the window. Oh, here's a pop-up. So the vendors table was changed. Do I want to apply that change? No, I just want to ignore it like nothing happened. Because all I wanted to do was look at it. So I don't like going into alter table when I really just want to describe. So my recommendation is in the book on page 53, or if in your notes, you put this command here as a little footnote for yourself. Okay, what I want to do now is just get rid of all of that stuff, get it out of my window. Matter of fact, if you notice under vendors, if I right click on here, and if I go select rows, limit 1000, if I just click on that, notice it did the same thing, select star from AP vendors, and basically down in the lower half, it's showing me the data. The reason it put AP vendors right there is it's actually being more explicit in saying from the AP database, show me that. It depends on the situation that this also works as well. But you can be more explicit and you're telling it exactly what database that it comes from. Now, while that command is kind of nice and it's giving us everything, all of the data, maybe what we really need is just a few pieces of information, and we don't need all of it. So if I go select, and then and if I say, well, matter of fact, before I do select, I want to go describe vendors. This way, I know what my field names are that I'm interested in, and what I want to do, I'm going to skip a space just for being easy. Select vendor name, comma, vendor city, comma, vendor state. And I can actually put more than, I don't have to put the whole line of information on. I can go from, I'm going to go AP vendors, and then I'll put a semicolon after that, and I'm going to just run the I. Notice now I have vendor name, vendor city, vendor state. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a little neater for programming. So what's interesting here is you can put the comma and just leave the comma at the end, or you can put it at the beginning of the first line. I actually put it at the beginning of the first line because it actually makes it easier when you're commenting out and testing stuff. So while this may be intuitive to how you think you want to do it, you really want to do it like this. Because this basically would allow you to comment out a line. And I'll show you that in a minute. Then I'm inputting into. So now notice here, what's separating, this is all one line of information. Notice the dot here. That's saying from here, from the last semicolon to the next semicolon, this is one line. So now if I hit this and I hit the I, it's going to execute that. But say if for whatever reason I don't want this line, just temporarily, and if I put a pound sign in front of it, now I can execute that line, and now I'm just getting vendor name, vendor state. So now, what if I want to, I am taking a look at, and if you scroll down, all of the vendors at this point. What if I want them, and they're not in any particular order. So what I can say is order by, hit enter, vendor name. Get rid of this semicolon up there because I'm making this line longer, and I'm going to put the city back in. And so now I'm going to execute this, and notice now it's all alphabetical. What if I wanted to say just give me the states of California. I need a where clause. Where vendor state equals CA. Now, if I run that, now you can see all the data I have is only California. If I put a T there for Connecticut and run it, I have one vendor in Connecticut. If I want to take a look real quick now, what's really nice about not have this could all be on one line, but by breaking it up like this, I can do some testing and debugging and say, well, I don't want my where clause right now. I'll use the pound sign before it, and now I'll run it. Now it's given me everything. Now I can test it without the pound sign and run it again, and it's giving me that. Now I can also change the order. And so, say for instance, I wanted to say order by vendor state and then by vendor name. And I'll take out the where clause so I get all my states, and I run the command. And I got an error here. I think I need a comma probably. Boom. There, yep, I forgot the comma to separate them. Sorry about that. And then I hit enter. Now you can see Arizona, California, and then all the states are in order. So now it's in order by vendor state and then alphabetical order under each one. Also, if I wanted to change the column headings for this, what I can do here is say name. I can say name, and then I can say city, and I can say state. And notice down at the bottom here, when I execute this, it now says name, city, and state. And what's interesting here is when you're actually in the browser mode, you can actually change the sort order just by double-clicking on the columns themselves. And that overwrites what you just did in the statement. But basically, you start off by executing your statement. It's in your sort order, in this case, state and then name. Notice that my headings are the same. So let's see what page I got us up to by now. Okay, so some of the tidbits that I had just done and showed you, things like the commas, laying it out, and then the labels weren't actually covered in a couple of the pages there, but this is just the common way that I always work when I'm in a database, and you will find that developing this technique and this style will be very, very helpful to you. On page 57 now, what it's talking about is snippets. And over here you can see that there are snippets that are, if I click on database management, there's snippets already in store there, SQL snippets and things like that. What I want to do is we're going to create a snippet, and we're also going to learn a little more about taking two tables and joining them together. Again, high level, this is kind of an introduction to how to start looking at data. My recommendation is, as you have been doing these commands all along, that you cut and paste them, if you haven't already, and put them in Notepad++. Create a folder called Chapter 2 Notes, Chapter 3 Notes, Chapter 3 SQL, or something like that. Create a file, and then just all the work that you do has experiments. If you put them into a just a notepad and save it as a file, will save you. Will be something you can reference later, and then you can also write your own notes. So let's. I'm going to erase all of this. I'm going to describe. I'm going to select star from invoices, because there's an invoice table there. And notice invoice ID, there's a vendor ID column, invoice number, invoice date, invoice total. And then if I go select star from vendors, spell it right, here's a vendor ID as well. Now, if I scroll down, I see like vendor 122 is the United Parcel Service. If I go up to the invoice line here, select, and I just run that, vendor 122 is just an ID. The name is not in the invoices table, but the reference to the primary key is. So what if I want to look at invoices, but I want to be able to see also the vendor name? So what I want to do, I want to move this line. I'm going to move this line up here in case I need it. I'm going to select star from invoices. Matter of fact, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a little different than the book on top of page on 57. I'm going to select the invoice ID, and I'm going to select the vendor ID, and I'm going to select the invoice number, and the invoice date. And that's coming from the invoices table. So now if I run this way I'm not going to get all of these columns and stuff. If I run this, now I'm getting invoice number, vendor ID, invoice ID, vendor ID, invoice number, and invoice date. So I know which record is, but what I don't have is the vendor's name. That vendor's name actually lives in the vendor's table right here. I need vendor name. So somehow I have to join the invoice file, which has got a lot of records in it, to the vendor file, which has one record for each vendor. And we do that basically with a join command. So the from statement gets modified slightly. We're going to okay, so here is the finished statement. What I did was just I tested it before I showed it. Made a couple of changes to it. First of all, I put a table reference, the letter I, in front of invoice ID, vendor ID, invoice number, and invoice date. And I added a column called V vendor name. It's invoice ID, I invoice ID, comma, I vendor ID, comma, V vendor ID, invoice number, invoice date from the invoices table with a sub-reference to I. So this I is actually referencing for that, comma, vendors with this V, referencing that, where the vendor ID from the invoices table equals the vendor ID from the vendor table. This now allows me to pull in my vendor name from the data. So if I run this, that will work. And now, because the invoice ID is an internal number, I really don't care about that. I'm just going to put a pound sign right before it and comment it out, and then I'm going to run it. Oh, because of the comma. Boom, 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 boom. because of the first line of the comma was an error. Now what I'm getting is the vendor ID, the vendor name, invoice number, invoice date. And as we talked about before, I could change this where I could say vendor number, vendor name, and I might want, I don't like invoice number the way it says it is, so I'll go invoice number and then invoice date. So now, notice also I put the semicolon down at the very end because that actually helps if I wanted to just comment out this top last line. So now if I run that, notice now I have vendor name, vendor number, vendor name, invoice number, invoice date, and it's a lot nicer looking and displayed. So this is not exactly the same statement that is listed in page 57, but this is a way to join two tables together. I'm going to pause it, type the statement that's on page 57, and then display it. Okay, so on page 57 of the book, you'll see this statement here, this select statement, which is actually joining from the vendors table, the invoices table, and the invoice line item table. So for every invoice, it might have multiple line items on it. So it's tying those three tables together. And they're all being joined by, here the vendor ID is to the vendor ID, the invoice ID is being to the invoice ID from the line items table. Notice this LI is referencing the LI from the line items table. And if I click and I run this, I'm seeing basically every single column from every single piece of information. But if I just wanted to have a couple of pieces of information, so say for instance, what I want would be the line item. From the line item table, I want the line item description, and I want the line item amount, and I want to know from the vendor table, I want the vendor name, and then I want to know from the invoice table, I want the invoice due date, or just date. Now I'm getting information from each one of these tables, and if I run this, now you can see I have the line item description, what it is we're being charged for, the amount for that, the vendor name, and the invoice date. Now I want to show you something here. I'm going to add from the invoice table, let's add the invoice total. And so I'm going to run this. Notice that, and then let's do one other thing, is add to order by invoice, and that would be, I want from the invoice, I want the invoice ID, because I want all the IDs together. So now if I run that, I should see some right here. Notice here from Wells Fargo Bank that the invoice total here is repeated because these are line items, individual line items that are all pointing to the same one invoice total. So what's happening is this line item 478 plus this line item $58.40 plus this line item $75.60 plus this line item $50 most likely will equal up to $662. If not, we have a billing problem. Okay, so now as you can see is we've created a relatively complex piece of code here, a little bit from page 57 in the book, and I've added a few things to it. If you haven't already, stop and go ahead and just stop the video, take a look at this and type this and do it. But if I just click on here and I click over here under my snippets and I click on this star, add the current editor as a new snippet. Now what I have is I have everything in the editor has a snippet of code, and I can actually edit this, and I'll just say snip1, and I'm just going to call it complex 1. I'm going to get rid of the vendors, and I just have this one piece of code. Now what I can do is I can actually execute a snippet, or I can insert the snippet at the text. So if I'm going to take Control A, delete all that, right click, if I execute the snippet, it put it in for me and ran the detail. Control A, maybe I want to pull the snippet up, insert it as text. Now I might want to edit this snippet and then run it. So the snippet is a nice way to store a lot of code that you're working on and refer back to it later. Okay, another way to save this work, you can save things in a snippet. You might want to save it to an external file. So when I'm here, you can see I'm in Query 1 box. If I do a Control S, typical box appears. I'm going to go to my desktop, and I'm going to say, I'm going to call it chap2 complex1.sql, and if I save it, now if I take a look over here on my desktop, I actually have a little SQL statement. I can edit this with Notepad, and it actually pulls it up in Notepad. So this is available to me. So whenever you're working with stuff, you can save all of your code and write it out to a file, not just a snippet. The other thing that we had done as well is we had already, when we actually created these databases, we opened SQL Script by going File, Open SQL Script. It pulls up our reference. We find our SQL Script, click on that, and now you can see that Chapter 2 Complex 1 is open. Now I can run it and do whatever I want with it. So that gets us a couple more pages ahead of the game. Okay, in life and in programming, sometimes developers and people do things that don't always work correctly. Typos, fat fingering, just wrong commands. If I was to go select Fred from vendors. Now remember, this Fred is where column names are supposed to be. If I run this, notice down at the bottom of the output action, unknown column Fred in field list. So Fred doesn't exist. So what I would need to do is describe vendors to see what my names are. And now what I have is I can see that I need to go back to these types of columns. So really, that was my error. And what I might do is I need to say vendor name, and then run that. Now I'm getting a list of my vendor names. Sometimes things like this happen, and so here it's going, what's going on here? Unexpected syntax error. So I'm expecting something here. Here it's almost thinking this might be a field label. So something's wrong here. So notice that this is a way that the underbar will show you that something is wrong as well. So also in complex statements as well, I think a little X, matter of fact, see right here, this little X, the red X, that's the thing I was looking for, shows you that there's an error somewhere that has to be fixed. I get rid of that M, I spell from correctly, and the little red X goes away. So there's several different ways. Look for the red X, look for the squiggly lines. When you run an execution, look for the red X's down at the bottom and see how things there might be showing you something's wrong. What if you need help? Well, there is a help button, and the help button can take you right out to the MySQL website. MySQL website, click documentation. We're in 5.5, click on reference manual, and you have all the documentation you need. And the more we'll be dealing with it. There's a nice tutorial on it, and so you could, if you want to get more engaged, probably by now some of the things that you've learned, a lot of the tutorial stuff is going to be command line stuff, but it's there's no shortage of information out there in MySQL. So for instance, if I was to pull up a browser, the biggest thing that if you have an issue and you need help with is you've probably heard of this website called Google, and if I was to say MySQL uppercased, now all of a sudden if I need to uppercase something, how do I do that? I go to string, I'll get a hit for that, and there'll be information on it, and right here synonym for upper is UCase. So upper would work and UCase would work. So what do we mean by that statement? Let's take this and let's actually take the function upper and wrap that around vendor name. I'm going to put vendor name actually here twice. And now if I run this, notice I'm getting the vendor name here in lowercase the way the data was in camel case, and I'm getting it in uppercase because of that function. And I learned how to do that by, where is my Chrome? I learned how to do that by simply Google MySQL, I want to uppercase something, and you will get gazillions of hits on any question. I guarantee you in this class, our level of investigation in MySQL, there's no question that hasn't been asked. So let's see where that puts us. Okay, we're on the home stretch for chapter 2, and that puts us basically, wants to show us some command line stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize that guy. I'm going to go start all programs, and I'm on page 66. Start all programs MySQL Server, the command line. Remember the password for the database that when we first created it. And now we are here, and we're at the command prompt. Remember all of those commands we were typing and working in the database, in the workbench, and on the object browser we got to see all the databases. Well, we have no object browser here, so we have to go show databases. There's the databases. Oh, look at, there's our AP database. I need to use the AP database, and now I want to select vendor ID, comma, vendor, comma, name. I'm going to hit enter, from vendors, and I'll put the semicolon there, and notice here I got a listing of all of the vendor IDs and the vendor names from that. So the same command, this is how we used to do database stuff back in the day, and we still do it a lot of times here. If I use my up arrow, I can even modify one piece at a time. I'm going to go upper, vendor name, down arrow, and then execute it. Oops, it didn't like it. Something was not right. Okay, didn't like that command, so I'm going to comma. UPPER. This should work. VEN vendor. Either that or I have to go UCase. This is messed up, so I'm going to just take the error. Select. Upper vendor name from vendors there, and so now I got the vendor name from that. So everything, and we're using tables. Let's see, I believe show tables is a valid command. You can see all the tables that are listed. Let's go describe terms, semicolon, and you can see that back when I taught this class last spring, we were doing all of our SQL work here at the command prompt, and your homework assignment was to give you screenshots. Everything you're doing in Workbench you can do here at the command line. The Workbench is nothing more than a fancy GUI, a fancy editor to this. So now that puts us to page 70, and 71 is your homework assignment. So basically there's a sheet on the Blackboard site that says to download the sheet, do all of the steps, put screenshots in to prove that you did it, and then move on to chapter 3, and we're good. Have a great day.